feelings. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
As you might have guessed, my name is Matt O'Brien, and I am the president of the Worcester Tea Party. And this is my 50th birthday party, so I want to thank you all for coming. Now, I would like to have a more intimate affair, so if I could encourage the more shy members of our audience to please step forward and come to fill up these closer rows.
I would like to second that. It's much easier to speak to.
Come on down. I promise, I don't bite or anything. Just come on down. We'll be starting shortly. I want to thank everybody for coming and for putting up with us, because, you know, we're all rank amateurs doing the best we can. Come on.
It shows the sort of power that comes with being the president of the Worcester Tea Party.
You guys get the ITC.
I know, right?
Okay, who's talking?
Patrick, I think I've said more than this. I told him it's my birthday.
I keep on saying.
Ready to get started? I'm already settled down. It is. Between like time. That right is better for the other. I could probably
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
My name is Edward Wagner, and I'm a founding member of the Greater Boston Tea Party. Let me, on behalf of Harvard, welcome the Tea Partiers to Harvard, and on behalf of the Tea Party, welcome Harvard community to our event. The genesis of this event started in a place called the 21st Amendment, which is a bar that's across the street from the State House. And after every tax day rally, we in the Greater Boston Tea Party tend to prepare there to quench our thirst before we go home. And as we were sitting there and we were talking about the future, what other things we could do, it was Matt O'Brien of the Worcester Tea Party who mentioned, you know, Charles Murray has just written his book proposing the civil disobedience as a reaction to federal government. Well, we're the Tea Parties. The Worcester Tea Party, the Greater Boston Tea Party, there's the Irish Tea Party, there's the German Italian Tea Party, there's a Knox Trail Tea Party, there's a Worcester Tea Party, and that's what we're going to do with them. But we all take our name from the most famous act of civil disobedience in American history. So I thought this was a topic for us. Professor Mansfield of the Department of School of Government offers to give us a venue, and I contacted the EI and Mr. Murray, not knowing who I was, and said, let's go do it. Charles Murray is the W.H. Grady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and he has written Losing Ground in 1984, Apollo, which is about moon landings, Bell Curve in 94, what it means to be a libertarian, human accomplishment, in our hands, real education, the happiness of the people, a more recent book, Coming Apart, American
bid you welcome to Harvard. Those of you who aren't from Harvard. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Boston Tea Party, the Worcester Tea Party, and the Program on Constitutional Government, which is part of the Government Department at Harvard. Our speaker tonight is Charles Murray. I don't think I need to introduce him because Edward Brightman just did that for me. In fact, saying everything that I was going to say. So, never mind. I'll introduce our speaker, Charles Murray, for his presentation, after which we'll have questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Mansfield. Professor Mansfield, for those of you who are not aware, has been keeping alive the spirit that of limited government and constitutional order that the Tea Party is famous for defending here at Harvard, and it has been a long, long struggle. Let me also start by saying what my own relationship to the Tea Party is. I am not saying this to suck up. When the Tea Party first developed, I considered it then a heavenly event. At a time when the mainstream politicians were failing to voice the principles that I hold most deeply, this amorphous, unorganized thing called the Tea Party came forth. And the words on that banner, advocating for public policy that promotes limited government, free markets, free speech, individual liberty, and personal responsibility, is exactly what I hold most dear. And the fact that you were able to get those issues into the public domain at a time when the enthusiasm for the new president exceeded all rational bounds was a contribution of invaluable contribution. Since then, some aspects of the Tea Party, I'm afraid, have contaminated the original vision. And the genius of the Tea Party was that it said, let's put aside our differences on social issues. Let's concentrate on first principles. And that is the spirit that I understand animates the Tea Party. So the sponsor of this event. That's the one that I want to support in the course of my remarks. This is not in the nature of the speech tonight, in the nature of an inspiring, send you out of the hall ready for the revolution kind of speech. It's more of a planning session. What we have is a speaker who shares all of your views, basically, about where the country ought to be, and starts out with a very pessimistic first premise of the book. And that first premise is that the American project as originally conceived is dead. Not just in trouble, but dead. The American project, as I think of it, is the idea, begun with the founders, that people can be left free as individuals and families and communities to live their lives as they see fit, as long as they accord the same freedom to everyone else, with the government providing a peaceful setting for that endeavor, but otherwise standing aside. When I say it is dead, I do not mean it is dead for everyone. If you have enough resources in this country and the right kind of position, you can de facto continue to live your life as you see fit. But that's been true of elites throughout history. People with the power, people with the money have been able to have the rules shaped in the ways that enable them to live their lives as they see fit. And it is precisely that idea with which America broke. America said that all people, not just people with power and resources, should have the ability to live their lives as they see fit. And we made progress. We made progress, at least for white people, and especially white males, for the first 75 years of our existence. But after the Civil War, we made progress, painfully slow, for other Americans as well. And then in the 20th century, around the third decade of the 20th century, fourth decades of the 20th century, we saw a series of events which undermined, eroded, and ultimately washed away the basis for that project. That's the first pessimistic statement. And I'm going to spend the first 15, 20 minutes of my presentation persuading you of why I believe that to be true, because persuading you of that is important. The solution I propose is fairly radical. It should not be adopted unless there is no other choice. I'm going to try to argue that there is no other choice. The second half of the proposition is optimistic, and that is that opportunities are opening for restoring important elements of the American project in a new incarnation. Not only are opportunities opening, I will attempt to make the case that in many ways the time is increasingly propitious for reestablishing many of the best qualities of the American project. It's not going to be the same as it was before, but in some ways it can be as good or better. Okay, let's go first. Let's get the pessimistic half of the argument out of the way. The American project, as originally conceived, is dead, and the place to start is with the Constitution. I am not a constitutional scholar. When I began to write this book, I was under a fairly loose impression that if we got the right 5 or 6 justices on the Supreme Court, we could make a lot of progress. And I could think of specific decisions that have been decided by 5-4 margins that I thought would have really made a big difference if the margin had voted on the other way. My optimism was overdrawn. It's not the case that we had slow, incremental, kind of invisible, boiling the frog kinds of changes in the Constitution, and that we can incrementally work our way back towards something closer to what the founders had in mind. From 1937 to 1942, there were a series of body blows, very explicit body blows to the Constitution, from which there is no retreat. The biggest example of that is the decision in Helbring v. Davis, 1937, which upheld the constitutionality of the Social Security Act. Way back, now I'm speaking to one of the few audiences I will speak to who knows a lot of this stuff already, okay, but I'm going to go over the bare bones of it anyway. At the time the Constitution was ratified, you had the enumerated powers. This is what the government may do. And they were introduced by a preamble. And in that preamble, the phrase general welfare was used. And even at the time of the constitutional ratification debates, it was a very contentious topic because there was, among the anti-federalists, great fear that that term general welfare could be interpreted to mean that Congress could legitimately pass legislation that did not involve the enumerated powers. And the authors of the Federalist Papers made that big point in the Federalist Papers and in this constitutional ratification debates, saying, no, that is not true. That what's the point of enumerating the powers if you're going to have general welfare in the preamble mean, oh, but they can spend on other stuff as well. Madison made that case very explicitly, and by the way, Alexander Hamilton helped. Disingenuously, but he helped. Because he knew that during the ratification debates, there were not 2 sides to this issue. There was not a set of the founders who wanted general welfare to mean that broader interpretation, except for Alexander Hamilton. All the concern was that it must not be interpreted that way, and Hamilton joined in assurances that it would not. In Helbring v. Davis in 1937, Cardozo, writing for the majority, said, with stunning bluntness, that the Congress may spend on the general welfare. I'm paraphrasing, but then it goes on to say, you know, the great statesmen have held the opposite, but it is now decided by decision. Well, because of that decision, all sorts of things subsequently could be enacted that could not have been enacted before. And in 2015, we could have 9 Clarence Thomases, or we could have 9 Nino Scalias on the court. They could not reverse that decision and say we're back to the enumerated powers, because to do so would be to say that 90% of all federal spending is unconstitutional. No Supreme Court can do that. no president would enforce that decision. The Supreme Court would lose its legitimacy. Ain't gonna happen. I'm not going to go through the other decisions that expanded the meaning of the Commerce Clause and that gave increased power to the regulatory agencies to expand upon vague wording in congressional legislation. I do describe those in the book. I will simply say they go in the same direction as the story of Pelfrey. That you have a situation in which the Constitution was fundamentally rewritten in ways that cannot be unwritten. That's one reason for saying we can't go home again. Another reason for saying we can't go home again is the increasing lawlessness of the American legal system. It's not lawless in some respects. I don't mean to use hyperbole here. But there are a variety of ways in which the law has become so complicated, so expensive, so subjective, that it's operationally indistinguishable from lawlessness. A lot of you, I bet, are science fiction fans, and you know Arthur C. Clarke's famous dictum that technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. Well, we are in a situation in which the law sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from lawlessness. A lot of times there are rationales for what has been done. For example, there is an elaborate rationale for why it can be true that you can be thrown in jail for something that a subordinate did in the course of the job, something you did not tell the subordinate to do, you did not encourage the subordinate to do, you may have even told the subordinate not to do it, and you can still be thrown in jail under a doctrine of responsible corporate official. There's an elaborate rationale for why that can be done. It still feels like lawlessness. For that matter, it feels like lawlessness if you can't afford to take your dispute to court. And let's face it, if in any kind of civil dispute, if you go to court, you have to face the prospect that by the time it's all over, you are going to be in debt to a lawyer for tens of thousands of dollars, and you can't afford it. In what sense, if it's too expensive to use a complex legal system, in what sense are you protected by the rule of law? It gets worse when we get to the regulatory state. Once again, I learned a lot in writing this book. I always thought that if the EPA came after you, or OSHA, or any of the other 70 regulatory agencies, that if you wanted to fight it, you went into the court system, which for all of its disadvantages was an option whereby you could get a fair hearing for your case. That's not how it works. And I bet some of you in this audience who are business people, small business people, know exactly what I'm about to say. Let's say it's the EPA that's come after you for some violation. No, you don't go to a regular court. You go to an administrative court. The judge therein being an employee of EPA. Prosecutors are employees of EPA. The rule that you are accused of violating very possibly was made up by EPA with only the vaguest legislative authority. This goes to one of the key decisions that I have not described at length, whereby in a case involving the National Broadcasting Corporation in the early 1940s, there had been this vague legislation by the Congress which said that the Federal Communications Commission should make up rules for granting licenses which were fair and equitable. And National Broadcasting Corporation said, you know what? Fair and equitable can be interpreted in a whole bunch of ways. The FCC is just making up whatever it wants and saying it's fair and equitable. The Supreme Court said that's okay. Since then, we have had legislation that wants clean water, clean air, a variety of things that all of us want, but with so little direction as to how they are being done, that the rules that the regulatory agencies come up with they are things that would never pass an up and down vote in the Congress, because they reflect the ideology and priorities of the administrators of the regulatory agencies, not something that was spelled out in legislation. So, the situation is this. It's as if the police not only could enforce the law, they could make up the law, and they could adjudicate the offenses that they released alleged. Now, of course, you can appeal. But of course, the appeals court, if it's the ABA, is a bank of judges who are also employees of the EPA. It is an extra-legal system. I do not use that phrase for dramatic effect. It's actually the phrase that's used by Philip Hamburger in a recent book called, the title is Administrative State Legal. That's not the exact title, it's close. It is extra-legal in the sense that the administrative state, the regulatory state, exists outside the normal legal system. That feels like lawlessness. And now we get to something that's very close to the heart of a great many of you, and that is the political process in Washington. If there's anything that has been made very clear by the events of this presidential campaign, it is that people on the right are frustrated as can be because it doesn't seem to make any difference if you elect a Republican majority in Congress, nothing gets done. There are these changes that we have wanted to see just get stuck. Well, I've got news for you. It's even worse than you think. The argument here is that the political system has become systemically corrupt. It's not that individual members of Congress are more venal or accepting bribes that they wouldn't have accepted in the past. Systemically corrupt means that the way the system now works is operationally indistinguishable in many respects from a kleptocracy. Think about the way the third world kleptocracy in Central Asia or Africa or South Asia operates. Kleptocracy means that anytime you want to get something from government, you have to bribe somebody. You have to bribe somebody even to get your case heard. You then have to bribe somebody to have specific steps taken. But you can get a lot of things done if you use those bribes. You can get special laws crafted that help you in your business. You can have your competitors hampered by having special laws passed. Or you could even have cases where in effect the police go in and make life difficult for your competitors. You can get a lot of things done in kleptocracies if you pay the money. I've just described the way that Washington works. If you are a business and you have a legitimate complaint that you need your senator or congressman to help you with, I promise you, you will not get in to have that case heard unless you make the appropriate political contribution. This is not a matter of liberals doing this, it's systemic. It goes across the board. And it is so embedded because of the demands of getting reelected being so high, it is so embedded that there is no way out of it. Furthermore, you now have a revolving door, whereby people who work in the Hill, either as elected representatives or their staffers, cash in. They move out of their elected positions, they move out of their government positions, and they make 10 times the salary on K Street working for lobbyists. Now, how this all came about is really interesting. I bet there are not many people in this audience who know this. The first firm that explicitly said we are a lobbying firm did not exist until the 1970s. Until as late as the Kennedy administration, hardly any major corporation even maintained an office in Washington, D.C. Because except for a few industries that were highly regulated, for most corporations, the government just didn't do that many things that made much difference to how a corporation operated. This is a fairly recent vintage, and I will simply say without elaborating upon it, that it was triggered in large part, first by television and by the increasing cost of campaigns. That was definitely part of it. It also was triggered by the Election Campaign Reform Act of the early 1970s, which was supposed to get rid of this stuff. And what it did, in the classic sense of creating backfiring effects, was it created an incentive for PACs. It created an incentive whereby no longer did you give money to a political candidate because you hoped he voted your way on a few issues, but mostly you didn't care how he voted, you just wanted him to be in a general political position. to a situation in which almost any vote that comes up before the House and Senate has explicit, highly motivated PACs that are competing to influence the senator or representative's decision. It's systemic corruption. Not bad people, it's a system that's broken down. I'm going to conclude an account that's sounding pretty dreary even to me, with one final consideration. And that is, we are looking at something that seems to be endemic to advanced democracies. A brilliant economist named Mansfield Olson wrote a pair of seminal books. First one was back in the 1960s called The Logic of Collective Action. And the second one was in the early 1980s about the rise and decline of nations. And Olson had a key insight that subsequently has been the subject of vast technical literature. In advanced democracy, there is an asymmetry of interests, so that if you have a special interest that can get a favor from government, they are highly motivated to sustain and attain that special favor, whereas the people who are against it are really hard to organize. Classic case in point, sugar. Americans pay about twice the world market price for sugar. Why do we pay twice the world market price for sugar, despite repeated attempts to get rid of this? Because you have a small number of sugar growers who really, really care about the laws that enable them to charge twice the world price for sugar. They care, and they support candidates who vote their way. How about the rest of the country? You can't organize the rest of the country to be excited about being overcharged for sugar. And so no matter what the majority in Congress is, Republicans, and this just happened most recently a year ago, the sugar subsidy stays. Because at the last minute, there is enough incentive to vote the sugar growers away that it swings enough votes to make it happen. Let me once again say, this is not a partisan thing. Republicans have been just as guilty as Democrats. And it is also something that seems to be irresistible when government has lots of things to sell. What made America different prior to the 1970s, 1960s was government had a relatively small number of things to sell. Defense contractors, roads, things like that. That's not a big part of the economy. Now the government has lots of things it can sell. Representatives and senators have lots of things they can sell. The demand for those things is grown accordingly. And what happens is sclerosis. Mansfield Olson called it sclerosis because it mimics the whole idea of arteries being blocked, of becoming rigid and inflexible. The only way to avoid this institutional sclerosis is apparently to lose a total world war. One of the things that Mansfield Olson used as the inspiration for his thesis was the difference between what happened to Japan and Germany after World War II and what happened to France and England. I mean, France and England still have most of their infrastructure and all of their political institutions intact. Japan and Germany were completely wiped out in terms of their infrastructure, but they also had their institutions wiped out. They had to start from scratch. And the result was vibrant economic growth in Germany and Japan, not the same for England and France. Okay, I've gone through all the things that have gone wrong, and the reason I've done that is to say we are not going to elect a president that is going to roll back federal power. We are not going to elect a Congress that will roll it back. We can elect a Congress or a president that will make improvements in policy. There can be better education policy. There can be better welfare policy. There can be better foreign policy. There can be a variety of ways in which it's better to have somebody on the right in power than not to have somebody in the right in power. But it doesn't roll back the power. And that's what I want to do. And that leads to the solution. The federal government, powerful as it is actually the Wizard of Oz. You looking around the room, we have a fair number of people who are old enough to have seen the Wizard of Oz. You remember the movie. Actually, you don't have to be that old. Our daughter, who was born in 1985, must have watched it 1,000 times. Or 86. Anyway, the Wizard of Oz is really scary throughout the whole movie. You've got this booming voice. And it just seems that you cannot resist this force. And then at the end of the movie, the curtain is pulled aside, and it reveals a stout, balding, little old man. Description gets increasingly personal. It's not who has a big microphone, and an amplification system. But he himself is pretty pathetic. Well, the federal government has taken on the responsibility for enforcing thousands of regulations. And it cannot possibly enforce unless we voluntarily comply with it. Just can't happen. Take something, take OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They have something in the order of 2,200 inspectors. They're responsible for 8 million workplaces. What are the odds that they're going to inspect you? EPA is responsible for, in effect, every piece of property in the United States. And they have very limited enforcement resources relative to that capability. But here is what they can do, and here's how they get away with it. They never get anybody to fight back. And the reason that they don't fight back is that they can't afford to. Here is the story of how the book came to be written. It is a true story. I am concealing any evidence that could lead to the identification of the person involved because you get in trouble. My wife and I have a friend who runs a small business. He runs one of these small businesses that routinely employ Latino workers. The difference between him and a lot of employers of such labor is all of his workers have visas. He spends about 25 grand a year to get visas for his workers. He brings them up from Central America. He pays their airfares. He pays good wages. We're not talking minimum wage here, but really good wages. He's a good employer, good neighbor, good member of his community, and he's did the right thing and documented his workers. And what he did was make himself a soft target. It's a whole lot easier for the regulators to go after him than to go after people who are employing illegal immigrants, because that involves a much more complicated task. And so they go after him, and it's one bad thing after another that he has faced. And he finally got so upset with the idiotic violations he was being accused of, and cost him a lot of money, that he said, I'm going to fight this in court. And the regulator, who was his nemesis, said, you try that, and we'll push you out of business. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you in this room have not had an official of the government say something similar to you, because they do it routinely. If you are engaged in something, it's not just that you're going to have to go through this business with taking your case to a court that's rigged in favor of the people who made the allegation. They can also make you cease and desist while your case is heard. So if, let's say you're a real estate developer and you're doing something and there's some small section of the land that you're using for your real estate development that involves an issue with the EPA. It may only be 5 acres out of a 1,000-acre lot, but if you contest that, EPA can say, oh, you have to stop everything you're doing on all 1,000 acres. Nobody can afford to do that. Well, when I heard the story of my friend, my wife was telling it to me, I got viscerally angry. I got really angry. So angry, I said to her, I don't want to hear any more of this because it's making me so angry. And then all at once, I suppose epiphany is too elegant a word to describe it, but it was pretty close to an epiphany. All at once, I thought first to myself of the image of a mysterious stranger suddenly appearing right after those words, you try that and we'll put you out of business, that come out of the guy's mouth. And this mysterious stranger who was wearing a black suit, carrying a briefcase, maybe riding a horse, comes up and he says, we are taking this man's case. We are not only going to represent him, we are not only going to pay for all the costs of that defense. There's 2 other things that are going to happen. First is we are going to litigate this aggressively. We know he is technically guilty of violating this stupid regulation. But guess what? Even your rigged administrative state allows us to make your life miserable. In the sense, you're going to have to respond to discovery requests. You're going to be dragged into court. You're going to have to work a whole lot of hours you would have otherwise had to have worked case, and we're going to publicize it. We are going to ridicule you and your supervisors. We're going to embarrass you in front of your supervisors. You're going to wish you had never seen us. And at the end of it all, if you find this guy, we are going to reimburse his fine. That made me feel wonderful. As I had. And then I had two other thoughts. One was, this is the work. And the second one was, you write books. And the result is, there's always a book. That's how it came about. That's the essence of the point. That you have legal defense funds that in effect make government an insurable asset. I like that idea. Government sort of being on a par with floods and locusts. You don't, with your house, you do not build a flood-proof house or a fireproof house. You do your best, but you buy house insurance in the unlikely event that something goes on. Well, why not buy insurance against the unlikely event that if you ignore stupid regulations that the government will find out about it and come after you? And I have two different kinds of mechanisms in mind for this. The first is a legal defense fund that is purely philanthropic. It has a couple $100 million to play with. It would have to be pretty large. And it defends people like my friend. The second is occupational defense funds. What if dentists got together and said, you contribute $100, $200 a year to the ADA, the American Dental Association. The ADA has high professional standards. It's as long as you're adhering to the ADA standards for running a safe dental practice. The government comes after you and says you aren't running a safe dental practice because you aren't following these stupid regulations. We'll defend you the same way. In other words, you have pushback. It's the kind of pushback that once credibility is established, you don't have to litigate thousands of cases. Once your credibility is established that you will do what you said you were going to do, you're going to make the official's life miserable, they back off. Just because right now it's the citizen who has to back off. It could work. What I'm trying to do is essentially analogous to what happens every day on America's interstate highways. On America's interstate highways in Maryland, where I live, is 65 miles an hour. The flow of traffic on Maryland highways, interstate highways, is about 72 miles an hour. Flow of traffic. A majority of Americans are engaged in civil disobedience on the highways every day. The state troopers cannot arrest everybody going over 65 miles an hour. And so what they do instead is arrest the people who are going crazy fast or who are driving erratically. And that's as it should be. And that is the first order outcome that I want. I want the regulatory state to use some common sense. The analogy is with the sports phenomenon, no harm, no foul. In basketball, the referees could call a foul every time they come out the court. They don't. And the reason they don't is it would make the game unbearable for both the players and the spectators. If what has happened, if the foul does not directly affect the action leading to a basket or not to a basket, they just say no harm, no foul. And that's the way it should be. If you have regulations on the books, I know of no way to repeal them. I do know of a way that we can effectively make the regulators say no harm, no foul. Some concluding remarks about why I think this could work and why I think we are actually in a propitious moment where a lot more of these things are coming down the pike. The first of these has to do with the extent to which the new cultural diversity in this country is creating incentives for people on the left to want to be left alone as individuals, families, and communities, as well as people on the right. States' rights was something that was a dead issue until very recently. States' rights was associated with the South, with segregationists, with protection of racist activities. You know what happened just a few years ago? Washington, the state of Washington, and Colorado passed laws legalizing marijuana. You do realize those laws are absolutely unconstitutional. If there is one thing in the Constitution that remains untouched, It is federal law trumps state law, period. What has the Department of Justice under President Obama done? It said, no, never mind. We will not enforce the federal law against Colorado and Washington as long as they observe a few guidelines. That's a precedent. That precedent is going to come back to haunt people. It's a precedent that is going to provide an increasing amount of wiggle room for states to go their own way because the federal governments can be forced to back off. This time for positions that are largely taken by people by the left, not by people by the right. A much more powerful force that is going to have pervasive effects on the kind of ways I want us to start ignoring the government is technology. The information technology revolution has empowered individuals in ways that were unimaginable and that make all sorts of rationales for government power outdated. I'll give you a quick example. In 1900, if somebody had argued with me that the federal government really needed to start inspecting food and drugs, there was a very strong argument that a progressive could make at that time, because it was really hard for consumers to get information about food and drugs at that time. Cheating and passing off toxic stuff was fairly easy. Today, suppose that tomorrow it were said that the federal government is no longer going to inspect meat. And suppose then that somebody at Safeway got the bright idea of selling bad meat. It would be all over the web in 24 hours, and Safeway would go bankrupt. The same thing would happen in a variety of other dimensions whereby information flows so freely now that all sorts of things that we used to need the government to do, actually, we don't need the government to do. But the even broader ways in which we can bypass the government. Well, one word, Uber. Uber, the ride-sharing service. There have been for decades, in every major city in the United States, a crony capitalist agreement between the city councils and the taxi companies, whereby there's been a monopoly that's benefited both of them. They have been absolutely unbreakable, even though they made no sense whatsoever. Uber did not politely go to the city council or the taxi monopoly and say, please let us in. They just show up and start operating. And by the time the political forces get their act together, this is the case in Washington, D.C., the service is already so popular that there's a political price to be paid for trying to shut it down. Furthermore, Uber has really deep pockets. So whereas there are lots of jurisdictions that are trying to fight Uber and trying to keep Uber out, and they've occasionally had some success, by and large they haven't. This kind of thing, which is also mirrored in Airbnb or renting rooms, are just the beginning. There are all sorts of ways in which technology is increasingly going to make it possible for us to treat the government like some grumpy, crazy old uncle that we have to have in the house. And it's still there, it's still kind of a pain in the neck, but we've learned ways to work around it. And that is going to be, in my view, the way the government increasingly looks. Now, is this the ideal way to solve the problem of an overreaching government? No, it isn't. If I could give you my ideal for a government, it would be having few regulations, needed regulations, simple regulations that people should obey reflexively because the rule of law is really, really important. That's not the world we live in. Those are not the opportunities that we have before us. What for me is the decisive factor is this. There are lots of pleasant places to live in the world besides the United States. I can think of a dozen countries just among the ones I know where I could have made a satisfying life for myself. What has made the United States different is our civic culture. And that civic culture at its best has been a wonderful combination of individualism, but also of cooperation, of people coming together to solve problems who are just neighbors in ways that really have no counterpart anywhere else in the world. We are in danger of losing that. And the kinds of measures I am describing can help sustain that civic culture among the people represented by the Tea Party who still cherish it. There is, in addition, a surprising resilience among the American people and affection for that civic culture. I am one of those who thinks that as time goes on, we can finally start to see a new coalition rise, which will not be limited to people on the right, which will include people who vote for Democrats, but who are also attracted to the same ideals of the American civic culture as people on the right are. I'm not talking about the out-and-out progressives, I'm talking about modern Democrats. I think in ways which were unthinkable 3 or 4 decades ago, the government has become them. Government is no longer a part of us. It's something to be resisted. It's something apart from us. And us are the American people trying to go about an American way of life unique among the nations of the earth and immeasurably precious. Thanks to you for all you have done to try to sustain that. Thank you.
All right, you see a possibility of states getting together